The appearance of NATO troops in Ukraine is unacceptable. That was the threat from Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov after a US delegation met with the Russians in Saudi Arabia. The warning was clear. If NATO takes a direct role in Ukraine, peace is off the table. But Britain isn't backing down. Instead, it's doing the one thing Putin fears most, sending Eurofighter Typhoons straight into the fight. This isn't just another aid package. These are top-tier NATO warplanes, high-speed, high-tech, and built to dominate the skies. And if the plan goes through, it will be the most direct Western military intervention in Ukraine yet. Moscow is rattled, Washington is stunned, and the battlefield is about to change in a way that no one saw coming. So what exactly is Britain planning? How will these fighter jets shake up the war? And is this the moment NATO's gloves finally come off? Let's find out. On February 18th, The Times was among the first outlet to report on Lavrov's comments about Russia not allowing NATO-affiliated troops on Ukrainian soil. Those comments came after Trump and Putin spent over 4 hours talking about how to end the Ukraine war with no involvement from European nations or, crucially, Ukraine itself. It appears that Trump wanted to project power from America. Only the US could negotiate peace with Putin, he seems to be saying. That's why nobody else was invited to the discussions. The UK may see things a little differently. The Times quotes a senior military source serving outside the UK as claiming that the talks between Putin and Trump were round one. Russia shared its position. Now it's time to negotiate further while the UK prepares to provide something that Ukraine has asked for since the idea of peace talks started floating around: security guarantees. Putin is clearly against allowing European nations to send large troop contingents into Ukraine. Having potentially tens of thousands of soldiers keeping the peace between his forces and Ukraine is the opposite of what Putin wants. So the UK came up with another idea. If it can't send troops in on the ground, what if it patrols the skies over Ukraine? A senior UK government source says that this would amount to an air policing mission in which the UK commits significant numbers of its jets to patrol the Ukrainian skies. Those jets would be Eurofighter Typhoons, with dozens needed to stay on constant alert for any Russian attacks after a peace deal is brokered. Having those planes in the skies would also mean that Europe could commit a smaller peacekeeping force on the ground in Ukraine, which might just be enough for Putin to reconsider his opposition to the idea. Another Times source also hints that the UK might use sophisticated monitoring technology to keep an eye on Putin's forces. If Russia attacks, that technology would alert the rest of the world. However, it's unknown if this monitoring technology would replace British troops on the ground or help them to keep Putin in line. Whatever the case may be, the outcome is the same. The UK just shocked the US by ignoring Lavrov's claims that there will never be a NATO peacekeeping force in Ukraine. Trump's initial negotiation has been ignored, and the UK is preparing for an operation that Russia and the US never expected. The question now is simple: what will that operation look like? There are no clear answers just yet, especially given that the UK's Eurofighter idea is still in its very early stages. However, there are a few ways that the UK could approach sending its Eurofighters to patrol Ukraine's skies. The first is part of a reassurance force. According to the Financial Times, the UK is currently working alongside France to create this force, which would rely on Western air power to enforce any ceasefire deal Ukraine negotiates with Russia. That force would be backed by the United States and exist to deter Putin from engaging in any aggression following his agreement to a ceasefire. The proposal builds on an earlier idea from French President Emmanuel Macron to deploy large numbers of soldiers to Ukraine. Only instead of soldiers, this approach would focus on the aerial aspect. That's an area where the West typically has an advantage over Russia, though it wouldn't seem like it from sheer numbers alone. According to Global Firepower, or GFP, which is a military strength aggregator, Russia's military has 4,292 aircraft, with 833 of those planes being fighters. The UK and France bring far fewer aircraft to the table. They have 1,607 between them, with the two combining to maintain a stockpile of over 339 fighter jets. The numbers game clearly plays out in Russia's favor. However, Russia has already demonstrated that its air force is a paper tiger during the Ukraine war. Despite having far higher numbers of much more advanced aircraft than Ukraine, Russia failed to achieve aerial dominance during the early stages of its invasion. Ukraine claimed to have shot down 342 Russian planes and 325 of its helicopters in February 2024, with the majority of those aircraft being destroyed within the first few months of Putin's supposed special military operation. Russia failed to take out Ukraine's surface-to-air, or SAM, missiles, with even those dating back to the Soviet era proving effective against Russia's aircraft. Once more advanced technology started reaching Ukraine via its Western partners, Putin essentially abandoned his initial aerial plans. He resorted to using his aircraft to send glide bombs into Ukraine from behind the war's front lines after his air force's weakness was exposed. Combine these issues with a lack of cooperation between aerial and ground assets, owing to Russia's segmented approach to its military, and Russia's aerial might isn't what it appears on paper. France and the UK intend to take advantage of these issues via its reassurance force. The Guardian dug deeper into this force in a February 19th article. It claimed that Western officials would commit no more than 30,000 troops to Ukraine as part of this force, with the majority of the peacekeeping focusing on air and maritime defense. Furthermore, the ground forces wouldn't be deployed on the Ukrainian front line, likely appeasing Putin and keeping US President Donald Trump happy. In this scenario, the UK's Eurofighter jets would serve as replacements for the 100,000 to 150,000 strong deterrence force Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has already requested. This approach could work for Europe. The size of most of the continent's militaries is modest, according to The Guardian, at least when compared to Russia, Ukraine, and the US. None can afford to commit too many of their troops, or else they'd leave themselves defenseless. Plus, US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth has already claimed that there will not be US troops deployed to Ukraine. That's essentially a veiled message to Europe that it needs to handle dealing with any upcoming ceasefire without American involvement. The UK's response, along with France joining forces with it, has come a lot quicker than the US expected. But this is just one potential approach, and it relies on the UK and France also being capable of committing 30,000 soldiers to Ukraine. If Putin says no, the reassurance force might be dead in the water. Perhaps the Baltic approach would work better. In a March 3rd report covering what an air patrol over Ukraine might look like, Defense Express suggested that the UK could take a similar approach to that seen over the Baltic states of Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia. All three are former Soviet states that believe they'll be the next nations targeted if Putin succeeds in taking Ukraine. Sky News' security and defense analyst Michael Clark appears to agree with this opinion. He says that the Baltic states are among the most vulnerable to Putin's ambitions, pointing out that Russia's leader has claimed all three nations to be part of Russia's natural empire in the past. Latvia and Estonia border Russia, making a direct invasion possible. Lithuania is a little more protected, though it shares a border with Russian ally Belarus and is dangerously close to the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad. As for the Baltic approach, it's been in place since 2004 as a NATO air policing mission. NATO members rotate deployments of fighter jets to Lithuania and Estonia, essentially giving these countries a makeshift air force to make up for their limited aviation and air defense capabilities. These fighter jets patrol the borders of the Baltic states, looking out for any Russian aircraft Putin may have sent on secret scouting missions. Once found, the Russian aircraft are escorted out of Baltic airspace. The approach is effective. For instance, September 2024 saw NATO jets intercept 6 Russian aircraft as they attempted to make their way over the Baltic Sea. All 6 lacked transponders and flight plans, suggesting Putin sent them to spy on the Baltic nations. The jets included 4 Sukhoi Su-30 MKIs and a Sukhoi Su-35, the latter being among the more advanced fighter jets Russia has in its arsenal. Once confronted, the pilots of those Russian jets acted uncooperatively but not aggressively, according to the German Air Force personnel who were part of the interception mission. A similar incident occurred around 2 months later, with this one involving the Italian Air Force intercepting a Russian Kut-A jet flying over the Baltic Sea and dangerously close to Norway's border. Again, the jets were not adhering to international norms, according to NATO, suggesting that Putin had nefarious purposes for sending them into the skies over the Baltic waters. These Baltic missions also involve surprisingly few aircraft. Defense Express says the Baltic air policing operation usually involves at least 8 fighter jets, with the more recent rotation including 4 Dutch F-35As and 4 French Rafale jets. Sometimes the numbers increase, especially if NATO believes Russia is going to enhance its Baltic efforts. For instance, 12 jets were scanning the Baltic skies between November 30th, 2023 and March 1st, 2024. 4 each of Belgium and Poland's F-16s, accompanied by 4 French Mirage 2005s. A similar approach could work for Ukraine. However, there are problems. The Ukraine war's front line stretches to around 700 miles, meaning more than 8 to 12 jets will need to be dedicated to a Baltic-like air policing approach. We also can't forget about Crimea and the Black Sea, both of which can offer routes into Ukraine and will need to be patrolled. The UK won't be able to do this alone. That's why it's working alongside France. Perhaps the reassurance force the two nations are planning will morph into an air policing force where each country provides around a dozen jets to patrol the skies over Ukraine. Still, that doesn't confront the Putin problem. Russia's leader doesn't want NATO troops of any kind on the ground in Ukraine. The odds are that he won't take the presence of NATO-aligned aircraft scanning the Ukrainian skies lightly either. That leads us to a potential third approach for the UK's aerial force, stationing Eurofighters in Poland. That should be easy enough to do given that Poland and the UK are NATO allies. Poland would also likely welcome deeper cooperation with the UK, given that it feels as threatened as the Baltic states by Putin. In November 2024, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk claimed that the threat of a world war sparked by Russia's aggression was serious and real. Poland also borders the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad, meaning it has a vested interest in preventing Russia from amassing more troops near its borders. However, Poland isn't Ukraine. Distance will be a problem. A British Eurofighter stationed in Poland would have to fly over 600 miles to reach Kharkiv, where fighting is ongoing. In contrast, the NATO air policing force stationed in Estonia only has to fly 124 miles to reach the Russian border, while those in Lithuania's Šiauliai air base only have a 62-mile journey to Kaliningrad. These short flight times mean the Baltic air policing force can respond to incoming Russian threats quickly. That won't be the case for a similar force created to support Ukraine if Britain's Eurofighters are stationed in Poland. By the time those planes have completed their 600-mile journey, it may be too late to stop Putin from whatever he wants to do. So stationing the Eurofighters in Poland appears to be a half measure. It would offer more protection to Poland and the Baltic states than it would to Ukraine. Plus, the UK deploying its Eurofighters to a country not involved in fighting Russia could be seen as a sign of placating Putin. Russia's leader doesn't want NATO-aligned jets in Ukraine, and he won't have them if Britain goes down the Poland route. It's far better for Ukraine if the jets are deployed on its territory. So we come to another question. Just how good are the jets the UK plans on sending into Ukraine? The Eurofighter Typhoon T1 is a multi-role combat fighter that took its maiden flight in April 2002, making it modern enough to be more than a match for most of the jets in Russia's air force. It's powered by a pair of EJ200 turbofan engines, each rated at 20,000 pounds with afterburning, and it weighs 46,300 pounds when fully loaded. The jet can reach speeds of Mach 1.8 and has a 55,000-foot ceiling. It also comes loaded with powerful weaponry, along with an internal 27mm Mauser cannon that can shred through aerial targets. The Eurofighter is equipped with ASRAM, AIM-120 AMRAAM, and Meteor air-to-air missiles that make it a clear threat to any Russian jet. The Eurofighter is also capable of firing long-range Storm Shadow missiles, which you may recognize as the long-range missiles Ukraine received from the UK and is now using to attack Russia on its own territory. Add Paveway 2 and Paveway 4 precision-guided bombs to the mix, and you have an aircraft that's as capable of taking out targets on land and at sea as it is of dealing with aircraft. The aircraft is used in the British, German, Spanish, and Italian air forces, with Saudi Arabia, Oman, Qatar, Kuwait, and Austria also maintaining stockpiles of the aircraft. That's another good sign for Ukraine. Multiple countries using the aircraft suggest that its combat capabilities impress, ensuring Russia will see the Eurofighter as a threat if it's deployed over Ukraine. Finally, the Eurofighter has an impressive range. It can stay in the air for 1,800 miles. That also means it's capable of handling flights from Poland to Kharkiv, if that's the route Britain takes with deployment, with gas in the tank for the journey back to base. So Russia would face a jet that's capable of going toe-to-toe with most of the aircraft it might send into Ukraine. There's only one more question to ask. Why is the UK concocting this plan now? Part of the reason comes down to the UK's concerns over being able to provide enough troops for a ground-based peacekeeping force in Ukraine. Despite UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer's February 16th claims that his country is ready to put boots on the ground in Ukraine, doing so would take a toll on Britain's military. The BBC quotes Lord Dannatt, who served as head of the British Army between 2006 and 2009, as claiming that Britain would need to send 30,000 troops on rotation into Ukraine as part of a peacekeeping mission. That's a problem for an army that only has 184,860 active personnel. It would mean the UK dedicating a sixth of its active soldiers to Ukraine, leaving the country weakened. Dannatt claims the UK would have to mobilise some of its 924,000 reservists to fulfil the requirements of such a mission. Plus, Starmer's claims that the UK will spend 2.5% of its gross domestic product on its military in the future still won't be enough. That would only fill the potholes left in Britain's military by years of underspending. Sending Eurofighters into Ukraine would alleviate these personnel issues. Britain would dedicate a portion of the 137 jets it has in its stockpiles to Ukraine instead of ground troops, providing aerial policing and serving as an early warning system for future Russian aggression. We also can't ignore the United States' role in the UK's planning. At the time that the UK's Eurofighter plan started to come to light, Starmer was preparing to meet with Trump at the White House. That meeting came in the wake of Trump's scathing criticism of Zelensky, in which he suggested Ukraine's leader was a dictator who could have stopped Russia's invasion at any time by making a deal. Before that meeting, Starmer said that any European military contribution to Ukraine's security could only be accomplished with what he dubbed a US backstop. Starmer added, "A US security guarantee is the only effective way to deter Russia from attacking again." Starmer's meeting with Trump has since happened. The UK's Prime Minister played to Trump's ego with the offer of an unprecedented second state visit, where Trump would meet King Charles III. The topic of Ukraine also came up, with Trump conducting an about-face and calling Zelensky a very brave man, while adding that the pair got on really well. Trump would flip-flop again a few days later during a heated White House meeting with Zelensky, during which he lambasted Ukraine's leader for not showing enough gratitude to the United States for its support. Another meeting followed, this time between Starmer and Zelensky, where Britain's Prime Minister told Ukraine's leader that he has the full backing across the UK. "We stand with you, with Ukraine, for as long as it may take," added Starmer. Britain is trying to play a balancing game. On one hand, Starmer is reinforcing the so-called special relationship that exists between the US and the UK. He's attempting to placate America's wild card leader, while convincing him that supporting Zelensky in Ukraine is the right thing to do. On the other, he's showing that Britain will support Ukraine regardless of Trump's comments. The same goes for the rest of Europe. Today it became clear that the free world needs a new leader. It's up to us, Europeans, to take this challenge, claimed European Union Foreign Minister Kaja Kallas in the wake of Trump's tumultuous meeting with Zelensky. Perhaps the UK intends to play a similar balancing act with its Eurofighter deployment. It gets to show Zelensky the support it claims to offer without having to dedicate as many soldiers on the ground to a peacekeeping force as it otherwise would. Plus, Starmer shows Trump that the UK, along with France if the Eurofighters are deployed as part of a joint reassurance force, that it's ready to take responsibility for security guarantees Ukraine needs. That, he hopes, will prevent Trump from negotiating a peace deal that favors Russia ahead of Zelensky. As if to emphasize that point, Starmer addressed the UK's willingness to take action during his meeting with Trump. He told the US president that the UK wanted to take a central role in negotiations to ensure a tough and fair solution that doesn't reward the aggressor. The only way peace will last, according to Starmer, is if the UK and its allies work together to support a deal. That's what it intends to do with its Eurofighter deployment. The only question now is whether the UK has convinced Trump to push back against Putin's claims that he won't allow NATO-aligned forces in Ukraine as part of a peacekeeping force. Do you think the UK will actually get its Eurofighters into Ukraine? And if it does, how many will it send? Will the US support the move? And what other European nations will get involved? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching the video.